The next item of business is Members' Business Debate on Motion 2900 in the name of Alex Rowley on local government finance and the state of the debt. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put, and may I ask those members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons, please. And I call on Alex Rowley to open the debate. Around 7 minutes, please.
Thank you. I would like to begin by thanking those MSPs who signed my motion, Local Government Finance and the State of Debt, in order that we can have this debate this evening. I also want to put on record my thanks to Unite Scotland for all the work they have done around this issue, and to the Unite membership who have campaigned up and down Scotland to raise awareness of the arguments around a debt amnesty for public services. There are a few Unite members in the gallery this evening, and they are very welcome. In bringing forward this motion tonight, I am aiming to raise further the awareness of the campaign for a debt amnesty on pre-devolution council debt. I'm also hoping that we can build a consensus in this Parliament here in Scotland on the issues that our Parliament can put the pressure on to the UK Treasury in Whitehall to agree a debt amnesty on pre-devolution council debts for Scottish local government. And I would hope to gain support of the Scottish Government for this campaign, and an agreement of the Scottish Government that they will make direct representations to the UK Treasury for all pre-devolution debt owed by councils. There are two broad reasons for making this claim on the UK Treasury. The first and the key one, as far as the case is made with the UK Treasury, must be fairness. Some £2.5 billion of Scottish Council debt owed to the UK Treasury's Public Works Loans Board dates back to pre-devolution. Interest rates on these pre-devolution debts are around 8%, but interest rates on post-devolution debts are around 4%, which is the standard rate for a 30-year Public Works Loans Board loan. This means Scottish residents are paying 50% more interest on pre-devolution debt to the UK Treasury than we are on post-devolution debt. It means that on average, Scottish local government is spending the equivalent of 44p in every pound of council tax collected from Scottish residents on servicing debt liabilities. Unite Scotland estimate 10p of this in every pound derives from outstanding pre-devolution liabilities. It means that in the 17 years since devolution, Scottish councils have sent back a minimum of £3.3 billion to the Treasury in interest payments on pre-devolution debt liabilities alone. So on the grounds of fairness, I suggest that we have a strong case for pursuing an amnesty, and I hope that this Parliament and the Government in Scotland will join the campaign and make the case to the UK Government for this to happen. So there is a strong case for the Treasury based on what is fair and what is right and just, and we need to make that case. But we also must consider the current financial pressures on Scottish councils and the growing demands being placed on local public services, as this makes the need for such an agreement on a debt amnesty even more important and crucial. A report today by the Accounts Commission makes very difficult reading and brings home the case for reform, but also the case for investment. The Chair of the Accounts Commission states, and I quote, "Councils are increasingly relying on the use of reserves to bridge projected funding gaps. Moreover," he states, "there is a dependence on incremental change to services, increasing charges and reducing employee numbers in order to make savings. These are neither sufficient or sustainable solutions for the scale of the challenge facing councils. We need to support councils to face up to these challenges, and this means stopping the cuts and investing in more preventative approaches, something the Christie Commission, supported by all parties in this Parliament, advocated. I think the Scottish Secretary of Unite, Pat Rafferty, best sums up the current position of local government in Scotland when he states, "Without doubt, we are facing a perfect storm of austerity across Scottish local authorities, and left unchecked, thousands of crucial jobs and local services will be further decimated to the point of no return." He continues, "We believe these extraordinary circumstances call for special measures, and that's why we are pursuing an amnesty on the pre-devolution debts owed by our councils to the UK Treasury." He adds, "An amnesty is a matter of political will, and there is certainly a precedence, as witnessed by the UK Treasury write-off of a £900 million housing debt in Glasgow City Council. It can be done." And that is a key point in this debate, I would suggest. It can be done. It just requires the political will to make it happen, and that's why this debate is important. As Unite say, this is not the whole solution to the massive challenges facing local councils, but is part of a series of measures that need to be taken to address the financial pressures councils are under, so that we can sustain jobs and services under public ownership for future generations. Presiding Officer, I did write to the Chancellor and the Scottish Secretary raising this issue with both, and I got a reply from the Chief Secretary to the Treasury that basically said no, whilst Mr Mundell did not bother to reply. So we know their position. But councils across the UK have been renegotiating debt and interest rates and making massive savings with private lenders, so the idea that the UK Treasury cannot do this is fanciful. Let us firm up our position and our resolve to fight the case for debt amnesty on the grounds I have set out today. Thank you.
I call Sandra White to be followed by Graham Simpson.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and thank you to Alec Rowley for bringing this forward. It's something that certainly not just myself, but many people, elected and unelected, are very interested in. I just want to quote some stuff from Mr Rowley's motion himself in regards to, obviously, the debt. Have around 2.4 billion of pre-Scottish devolution debt liabilities, and in the very last paragraph considers that Scottish devolution was intended to be a new beginning for Scotland, and notes the view that the time has come for the historic burden to be dropped by the UK government. Whilst I agree entirely with what you say, Mr Rowley, I think we have to be perfectly honest in this particular debate. I have to remind Mr Rowley there was a Labour government that were there at that particular time, and I would ask, not just before devolution, but when devolution came in, why it was never ever suggested under a Labour administration administrating a Labour government in Westminster, why it was never raised then. That's something I have to ask, because I'm not saying I'm cynical, but I do think we need to ask that. And even further on from there, it was a Labour government that brought in PFI, which is costing even more monies in that respect. So whilst I appreciate what you're saying, I absolutely agree about the debt, I have to ask why now, at this particular time. If you just let me finish, Mr Finn, I'm going to quote yourself as well, actually. I have to ask at this particular time, why all of a sudden, at this particular time, when the Labour government was there, and you mentioned yourself as well, Mr Rowley, it was the Labour government that wrote off the debt of the housing, a historic debt, Glasgow City Council, to transfer these houses to Glasgow Housing Association, which was unaccountable, not just to the council, but to the people whose houses were there as well. That was Gordon Brown that did that, and it could have been done then. Why was it not asked to write off the debt when he was doing this particular one? That's a question I have to ask. You thank Unite Union, and I absolutely thank them as well, because I've actually been on the picket line with some of the people in Glasgow that I know in regards to writing off the debt. I also thank Unison for their briefing also. And a quote from Unison's briefing, they mention PPP, PFI as an expensive form of borrowing, a very expensive form of borrowing. And I could also quote Neil Findlay in that same document that Unison sent to us. Mr Findlay, you said at the time it would be financial madness to buy a house on a credit card, and yet that is exactly what we're doing with PFI and NPD. In some cases, I'll let you in a second, in some cases we are paying double-digit interest rates on some existing PFI projects. I ask, why did Labour bring PFI projects in, and why did you not ask a Labour government in Westminster, a Labour government here, to write off the debt? I'll let you in, Mr Findlay.
Thanks very
Neil
much.
Findlay.
And she mentioned my quote on PFI and NPD debt. NPD is the Scottish Government's scheme, which is PFI by another name. And I actually believe, irrespective of which government was in power, that we now have a unique opportunity, because we have got borrowing powers coming to this Parliament and we have historic low interest rates. We have a unique opportunity now. We won't have it ongoing to renegotiate these debts, whether they're historic debts or whether they're current NPD debts. We should take that opportunity now.
No more than another minute, please.
Sorry, I thank Mr. As I said, I appreciate the motion as it is, but I still ask why, when it was a Labour government in Westminster, a Labour government here, you did not even ask them to write off the debt. As Mr Rowley said, they wrote off the debt on council housing in Glasgow. They could do that. Why couldn't they have did it for other debts? No, your party was in power and you never even embraced or wrote or asked them. Gordon Brown was in power at that time, and yet they didn't even write it off. So maybe you might call me cynical. I would like us to get together in something.
Could you two realise that you speak through the chair and when properly asked to, rather than to have an individual argument? Thank you.
Apologies, Chair. I didn't realise I was doing that. As I said, I think it's a good debate to have, but obviously I don't understand why, when Labour was in power in Westminster, Labour was in power here, they could not write this debt off then. And all of a sudden now, apparently because of low interest rates, we are being asked to take this on board. Thank you very much, Presiding Officer.
Well, we've got off to a very consensual start. Graham Simpson to be followed by George Adam.
Thank you very much. Hopefully you won't take up too much of your time today, but can I first of all thank Alex Rowley for bringing the debate. Local government finance is always worth discussing. You know, I share your view on that. It's certainly in the news today, as Alex Rowley has pointed out already. We have the timely Accounts Commission report on performance and challenges in 2017, and that shows what most of us in this chamber realise, that local government has been squeezed over many, many years in Scotland. We've seen a long-term decline in revenue funding. Under the SNP, total revenue funding will fall this next year by £216 million in real terms, as that report shows. And COSLA say there's been a £550 million cut in the local government settlement. They call for longer-term planning. All this, of course, has an effect on jobs and services. More than 15,000 full-time equivalent jobs have gone in local government in the last 5 years. It's pretty depressing. Mr. Stewart wants in, absolutely.
Kevin Stewart.
Will Mr Simpson recognise that the Scottish Government's discretionary budget will have been cut by £2.9 billion, 9.2% lower in real terms than it was in 2010-11 by 2019-20? This is his government that is slashing our budget. Does he not realise that that has an effect on every single public service in Scotland?
Graham Simpson.
That was more of a speech than a question. However, the premise of the question was entirely wrong, because as the Fraser Allender Institute has pointed out, in fact, Derek Mackay's own figures show that there's been an increase this year from the UK government, and that's why my colleague Murdo Fraser has described Mr Mackay as a very lucky man indeed. And yet still he's chosen to cut local government. So 15,000 jobs have gone, full-time equivalent jobs, in the last 5 years. Now, if we come on to the thrust of what Alex Rowley is asking us to consider, which is an historic debt. Now, there is a bit of a contradiction between Alex Rowley's motion and what Unite are actually calling for in their paper, which I have read, and it is very interesting. The paper, it seems to me, is calling for an amnesty on the interest, but Alex Rowley appears to want to write off the debt entirely. He does not mention an amnesty on interest in his motion, so I'm not really clear where he's coming from. It would certainly be irresponsible for us to, here today, call for a writing off £2.4 billion of debt on the day before the UK budget, and perhaps that answers Sandra White's point. Yes?
Kezia Dugdale.
Recognise that Unite Scotland are also asking for the reprofiling of debt, and as a Conservative, a fiscally conservative can at least accept the merits of using the fact that interest rates are at an all-time low to save government and local government money. Surely a fiscally conservative could support that.
Graham Simpson.
I'm really trying to get the Labour story straight in my head, because I'm not really clear where you're coming from. If you're asking for £2.4 billion of debt to be written off, that strikes me as being somewhat irresponsible. If you're asking for an amnesty on interest, that's an entirely different matter. Now, Alex Rowley may want to act like a Labour Chancellor, but we're certainly not going to be playing that game today. I've checked with COSLA. They've made no representations on this matter at all, although they do have some sympathy, of course. It would seem to me that COSLA, if any representations are to be made, are probably the group to make it to the UK government. I note that Alex Rowley has done so himself. You should probably use the Scottish Government if they're so minded, but you certainly have to ask first. But I think what we certainly need to be clear on is what Alex Rowley is actually calling for.
George Adam, to be followed by Alexander Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to thank Alex Rowley for bringing this debate to the Chamber because, like myself, he is a former councillor and he's probably heard debates about funding within local authorities more often and more time than we both of us care to actually remember. And one of the important things about this debate is, it's funny, when I was listening to my colleague Sandra White, you know, it sounds like we're almost in pre-devolution days here when we're having this debate, because it sounds like a debate that we had way back in the day. And it's one of the things that I think there is merit in what we're trying to discuss here today, because I think there is some merit that we do have to talk to Westminster and ensure that we manage to get something out of this as well, because at the heart of this debate is the key point that local government has financial autonomy, and that's something that must continue. But in order for us to do that, we need to make sure that Westminster, as the individuals who actually gave the loan, are the ones that actually do something. And I do have some concerns with that. Local councils must be held accountable and be allowed to pay off their debt. But however, I think they should get a bit of flexibility. Looking at Unite's report here, they've got some of the historic debt, and it's in Renfrewshire Council, my own area, it's 97 million, and post-devolution it's 165 million. So in the real world, that effectively means, and former councillors in here will be aware of this, that's when the officer normally says to you, we don't have the capacity for that project, councillor, because we don't have the funding capability to be able to do it, because you are carrying this debt. And it's similar to what Sandra was talking about with the housing, Sandra White, with the housing debate, where effectively for years councils were carrying debt for houses that in some cases had already been knocked down at certain stages as well. So I think it's important that councils get that flexibility, and I welcome everything here. But as I said earlier, it's only the lender of the loan itself that can actually write off this debt. And we would have to appeal to the better nature of the UK government, and considering all the issues we're currently facing with Westminster Realm, I think that's quite a difficult ask as well. I do believe in negotiation, former car salesman that I am. I think we could probably find some common ground somewhere in these things, but if we don't get this right, it's going to actually hit our poorest areas, because if, for talking sake, we end up with a situation where the Scottish Government tried to find a way to have an amnesty in its own, it would affect our own budget that we've already settled with local government just now. And I also agree, my concerns are with Westminster. You know, call me a cynic, presiding officer, but any plea to Westminster to write off pre-devolution debts would no doubt be met with ridiculous terms and conditions. And an amnesty could require the Scottish Government to dramatically reduce its budget, thus decimating agreements already made. So should Westminster not be more agreeable, these further cuts to offset council debts could already affect the £120 million extra that's already gone to local government. But any change of this debt would have to be dealt with carefully, and that's my biggest concern. We need to make sure that when we do these negotiations that we have to deal with. I do believe that this is a very important debate for us to have with local government and with Westminster, because it affects delivery of the actual services that everybody in our constituencies and communities actually deal with. And one of the things I'd like to say in closing, presiding officers, this debate is extremely important for us to have it, but we need to explore all the options, and it needs to be in a non-confrontational manner. And listening to Mr Simpson's interventions earlier on, it sounds as if the Tories in Westminster don't want to have this open debate. Because Mr Rowley has actually stated that, yes, he's got some ideas, the government will have some ideas, Scottish Government, but we need to make sure that Westminster buy into this as well. Because for me, if we don't get this right, we're going to actually cause more chaos and more financial troubles from our local authorities. And that's something that none of us want. So let's have this open and frank discussion, and let's see if there is something in some capacity for us to be able to do something here.
Can I have Alexander Stewart, followed by Neil Findlay?
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I am still a serving councillor in Perth and Connaught Council, so I refer members to my register of interest. May I begin by thanking Alex Rowley for securing this debate today on the issue of debt owed by local authorities in Scotland. Whilst I might not agree with all of the conclusions of the paper published by Unite and Union Scotland, it strongly makes the case that many councils face serious challenges in funding their public services. And as a local councillor myself, I've seen that, Deputy Presiding Officer, in full. Whilst the £2.4 billion worth of pre-devolution debt owed by public works loan boards accounts for a not insignificant amount of money, the total that's been accrued of Scotland's local authorities is round about £13.6 billion. This has contributed to making local government debt per household in Scotland almost twice that of England and Wales. The greatest financial pressure facing our local authorities, however, are the result of the lack of sufficient funding from the Scottish Government, which has made it necessary for councils to borrow more, Deputy Presiding Officer. Audit Scotland revealed that local government in Scotland has suffered a 10% real-term cut in funding since 2010-11. This is the real challenge facing local authorities, and the Accounts Commission have recognised that in their report. Happy to do so.
Mr Stewart recognised that the reduction to local government is about the same as the reduction to the Scottish budget overall, which is thanks to numerous Tory chancellors who have slashed Scotland's budget by £9.2 billion up to 2019-20. Do you recognise the actions of your Chancellor in terms of the budgetary position that we're in?
Alexander Stewart.
Mr Stewart, you have heard it many times before from our benches. We know, and you also know, that there has been an increase in funding to you. I'm sorry, it is true. You're in a better position today than you ever have been because of the Barnett consequentials and all the rest of it. So you have been the people who have attacked the local government here in Scotland when you've been in charge for the last 10 years.
Can I remind members to always speak through the chair, please?
So the report makes it quite clear that decisions made by the SNP and Labour to raise council tax in some areas by up to 3% will have a limited impact on council resources. And it's also worth bearing in mind, Deputy Presiding Officer, that with the range of local authorities that we have, 32 of them across Scotland, and their debt ranges from about half to over 1.5 times the council's annual income. Different councils have different ways of dealing with the challenges, and we've seen that in savings and reorganisation. Councils can benefit from learning from examples from each other about best practice. Audit Scotland have talked about a handful of councils having a rating of strong financial management. Now, that speaks volumes if we have councils that do not have strong financial management across Scotland and the difficulties that they face. Councils can, as I say, learn from each other, but at the end of the day, efficiency savings and workforce management planning can only go so far before the resources that we have take us to extreme measures. In conclusion, Deputy Presiding Officer, at the time where our councils are facing increasing pressure and an ageing population and their workload has increased, we need to ensure that we do all we can to adequately fund and allow them to continue to provide high-quality public services without the need to see sufficient borrowing continue. Deputy Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government urgently needs to rethink their approach to local government, and that I firmly believe. Thank you.
I'll just let the Minister come back to his seat and perhaps apologise to us for having had to leave the chamber.
I apologise, Presiding Officer.
Call Neil Finlay to be followed by Andy Whiteman.
Presiding Officer, can I declare an interest as a member of Unite the Union? Having been a councillor for 9 years and saw at close quarter the capacity of local government to change people's lives for the better, it actually breaks my heart to see what has been done to our councils at the moment. And actually, I am thoroughly depressed with some of the contributions that I've heard this afternoon. Unite have done a very good piece of work on this, and they have exposed how there has been an 8.5% cut in council budgets over the last 6 years alone. And what we have to remember is what these cuts impact on. They impact on the very services that civilise our society, that educate our kids, that care for our elderly, that keep our communities safe and clean. That's what local government is all about. And if we combine this with the retention of a regressive system of local taxation, we see real tragedy, and I use that word advisedly, tragedy occurring because local government is in the front line of the fight against poverty and inequality in our communities. Councils have lost tens of thousands of jobs. No task force, no emergency debates, no talks of crises from the government, just denial and jobs being lost hand over fist as services are cut. My local authority in West Lothian has been starved of 90 million. Similarly, large cuts in Midlothian, Edinburgh even worse, and every other council across Scotland too. And on top of this, we see the UK government ripping councils off with high interest rates on historic debt. And I say to Ms White, I don't care if it's a red government, a blue government, a yellow government, or whatever government, I would be raising these issues because they're fundamental to the proper running of local government. Of course I will.
Sandra White.
I thank the member for taking an intervention. What I was trying to get across was, you were a local councillor, people were elected. Why didn't you ask the Labour government, when it was in power here, to write off the debt or the interest rate?
But can members please remember to speak through the chair? And could you also wait until your name's called before you start talking again? Miss White, sit down, please. Now from Mr Finlay.
Sorry, Presiding Officer. Miss White's making an assumption that we didn't lobby to do these things when Labour was in power. Well, you would be wrong. Miss White would be wrong on that, because this has been on the agenda for many, many years. This is not something that's just come to our attention now. And on top of the cuts to local government, we see the UK government ripping off councils with this historic debt. I don't know anyone who is receiving 8% on their bank account balance at the moment. Maybe Mr Simpson, is it Simpson with his expansive portfolio of shares and whatever it is, I'm sure he maybe is with some of the people who manage his finances, but I don't know any normal person who is getting 8%. Sorry, okay, hurry up.
Graham Simpson.
Well, first of all, Mr Finlay has no idea whatsoever about my personal finances, and I do not have a vast portfolio of shares. Perhaps he'd like to retract that. Could he be any clearer than Mr Rowley was? Is Labour today asking for a total write-off of £2.4 billion, or are they backing the Union in calling for a debt interest amnesty? Two very different things.
Neil Finlay.
I do withdraw that, and I apologise for that. But if Mr Simpson is saying that he'll support us in getting rid of the interest rate part, let's go for that as a starter. If he wants to join us and he wants to call for the eradication of all the debt, I'm quite happy with that as well. So let us put hands across the chamber and join in whatever it is Mr Simpson wants to get rid of, so we can sign a letter and we can all send it off to the UK Treasury today. I'm sure he'll be first out with his pen. Can I also say that I think there is a case for us to look not just at this debt, but also the debt that Sandra White mentioned, the PFI NPD debt. That is past PFI debt and current NPD debt. Because, and irrespective of which government accumulated that debt, because we do have an opportunity at the moment where we have historic low interest rates, we are getting borrowing powers for the first time, and there is an opportunity to renegotiate those debts. There are examples in England where that has done, freeing up tens of millions of pounds for public services. So my plea to the Minister is, why aren't we doing it? Why aren't we doing it? I think we should be setting up a debt recovery unit within the Scottish Government and looking individually, case by case, on NPD and PFI debts. Look at them individually, not as a blanket approach, and see if those can be renegotiated to free up more money for local government. Imagine what the two things combined would do for the financing of education, for the financing of social work, for our local environment, and for rebuilding the services that are being cut year in, year out in our communities.
The last of the open speeches, I call Andy Whiteman.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I too thank Alex Rowley for initiating this important debate, and I also welcome Unite's report, Local Government Finance and the State of the Debt, and agree with the case for debt interest amnesty. I want to stress two main points in this debate. The first is why limit this to pre-devolution Public Works and Loan Board debt, and the second is public debt in an age of austerity and the consequences of that. Now, in a report published in November 2016 by the Scottish Green Party, a month before the Unite report on local government debt in Scotland, we identified total debts of £11.5 billion. Unite's figure is £12.1 billion, much the same. And there are three elements of this long-term debt. There's pre-devolution Public Works and Loans Board debt, there's post-devolution Public Works and Loans Board debt, and then there are things called LOBOs, which I'll come to in a second. Now, £9 billion of Public Works and Loans Board debt, about 20% of that, £2.4 billion, is pre-devolution debt, and 80% is post-devolution debt. But the further £2.4 billion debt that we identified in our report in November is lender option, borrower option loans, so-called LOBOs. Now, these are very long-term loans, often lasting 40 to 70 years. They were initially offered on fixed teaser rates, typically undercutting PWLB rates. In the 2010 spending review, Public Works and Loan Board rates rose from 0.15% to 1%, reduced to 0.8% following the 2012 budget. And LOBOs appeared just as the Public Works and Loans Board rates were being hiked. And I think, Presiding Officer, it would be instructive to delve deeper into that coincidence, because today some councils are facing 7 to 9% interest rates on LOBOs. We regard LOBOs as illegitimate, odious and unsustainable, and it's not even clear how much is being paid in debt. But it's not just LOBOs. It is about the post-devolution Public Works and Loans Board debt. In 2015-16, Scottish local authorities paid almost £1 billion in interest to the Public Works and Loans Board. And of that, Unite is proposing an amnesty for only 20%. In our report, we argue that there's also a strong argument for writing off all post-devolution debt, Public Works and Loans Board and LOBOs. And I don't understand why, if a case can be made, and it can, for pre-devolution debt, the same case doesn't exist for post-devolution debt. Finally, Presiding Officer, much of this debate is a consequence of the age of austerity. It's a consequence of the fact that the government bailed out the banks to the tunes of hundreds of billions of pounds following the financial crash. And as we saw from the Accounts Commission report published this morning, local authorities face a very, very challenging few years ahead. Now, debt issued by the Public Works and Loans Board is owned by the government. It is public debt. Debt forgiveness costs the government nothing, because it costs the government nothing to issue. So there is a case to go beyond an amnesty to actually write off all of this debt. And I think the moment now is significant, in contrast to what Sandra White was talking about with Labour governments previously, because of the austerity we're living in, because of the very real challenges facing local government. I think there's a clear moral, economic and political case for writing off all of this debt. The question I'm left with, however, is why is the focus of Unite only on pre-devolution debt? As I say, it costs the Treasury nothing to write this off. It would improve the balance sheet of local government by £9 billion and revenues by hundreds of millions a year. To conclude, debt is an important issue. So too is the future of local taxation and the need to scrap the regressive council tax, and so too is the future of local government finance. As a whole, later this week, we'll be publishing proposals to strengthen the local government financial settlement. But to conclude, it's clear that we and Unite, and indeed Labour, agree on debt forgiveness, but we argue that we should go much further.
I now call Kevin Stewart to close this debate. Around 7 minutes, please, Minister.
Presiding Officer, I welcome the opportunity to respond on behalf of the Government to today's motion on local government finance and the state of their debt. The motion asks the Parliament to consider that Scottish devolution was intended to be a new beginning for Scotland, and to note the view that the time has come for the historic financial burden to be dropped by the UK Government. I would start by recognising that since this motion was tabled, the Cabinet Secretary for Finance in the Constitution announced on the 2nd of February that local authorities would benefit from an additional investment of £160 million to support local services. Taking next year's local government finance settlement, including the extra £160 million, plus the other sources of income available to councils through reforms and having set their council tax and funding for health and social care integration, the overall potential increase in spending power to support local authority services now amounts to over £383 million, or 3.7% in 2017-18 compared to this year. That, despite the Tory austerity that they are unwilling to admit, and what they fail to have told the Chamber today, and Fraser of Allender points out, is that there is a difference between discretionary spend and other spending which we have no control over whatsoever. Turning now to some of the detail in the various reports on this issue. I've read with interest the Unite paper on local government finance and the state of the debt, and have listened to this debate. And I would thank Mr Rowley for bringing this to Parliament for discussion. I'm happy to support the terms of this motion and would of course welcome an amnesty on pre-devolution debt, or even a write-off of the whole amount, as it would free up resources to support the investment in the services delivered by our local government partners. However, we also need to be mindful of the likely UK government reaction to such a request. I don't think it would be particularly favourable. If we thought there was any prospect of securing some concession from the current government, then we would have no hesitation in making an approach. Sadly, the reality is that for the reasons I will develop further, I think we all know there would be a very negative reaction from the UK government. The Unite report makes a number of relevant points, which I would like to reflect on. Firstly, the report notes that the pre-devolution debt is unique as the interest rate on this debt carries such a high interest rate, 8%. The report compares this with current rates charged by the UK Government on loans from the Public Works Loans Board, which are at 4.4%. Interest rates over the pre-devolution period were at a time of high interest rates. Unfortunately, we can probably all remember the 1980s and early 1990s when interest rates rose to nearly 15%. So while the pre-devolution debt is unique given the average rate of 8%, it's also the case that the timing of devolution came at a time when rates were falling, and this trend has continued. I suspect that HM Treasury would inevitably attempt to argue that to be able to lend to local authorities, central government itself needs to borrow at the prevailing rates. They would say that comparing rates from the late 1990s, when interest rates were higher, to current interest rates, which are at a record all-time low, is not relevant when considering pre-devolution debt. Analysis shows that of the total outstanding pre-devolution debt, nearly half of the £2.5 billion outstanding was borrowed in 1997 and 1998. That is immediately prior to devolution. Further, 99% of the pre-devolution debts are interest-only loans, and I would expect the Treasury to argue that this means that local authorities have not made any repayments on these loans since taking the loan out prior to devolution, and will not repay any amounts until the maturity date of the loan. Borrowing on these terms was a decision taken by each local authority at the time. We also have to bear in mind that if the councils had chosen to borrow on a repayment method, then the value of the outstanding debt and the associated interest costs would now be lower. Local authorities have had borrowing powers for a significant number of years. And of course, decisions on borrowing are rightly made by each local authority, as Mr. Adam pointed out. Central government does not require them to borrow. This is a decision that they take for themselves. And of course, they employ professionally qualified staff and often use professional Treasury advisors to manage and advise on their Treasury management strategies. I'll give way to Mr. Finlay.
Neil Findlay.
Got in here last minute. So to kind of summarise what you're saying today is you don't think they'll do anything, so you're not going to speak to them. And the second thing is, well, it's all local government's fault for negotiating bad deals in the first place. That kind of summarises what you've said so far.
Kevin Stewart.
Well, if Mr. Finlay listens to the conclusion of my speech and had listened to the beginning of it, he'll find out exactly what I'm saying. If I go back to Treasury management strategies, the types of loans and the period of any loan are therefore rightly all matters for each local authority. Presiding Officer, it is important to say here that by providing this analysis, I am not in any way defending the debt costs associated with the pre-devolution debt. I'm simply pointing out the reality of the likely stance the UK government will take. If it were possible, I too would wholeheartedly support any moves that would deliver a reduction in these costs. I also believe that even if they were minded to offer any concession, that would not come without catches. And would also expect them to say that it will be up to the Scottish Government to provide an offsetting reduction to our budget, which of course would remove much needed resources at the very time they have already imposed cuts to our budget, which will mean that by 2019-20, the Scottish Government's discretionary budget will be £2.9 billion, 9.2% lower in real terms than it was in 2010-11. So, to conclude, whilst I too would like to see an amnesty for, or a write-off of pre-devolution debt costs, for the reasons I have outlined, I cannot see the UK Government agreeing. I wish things were different. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
This meeting is closed.